Hi there, welcome to Urbinary, the podcast cataloging the everyday and extraordinary in the city.
Hi there, and welcome to Urbinary. I'm Sareh, and I've got Tommaso with me for this episode.
Hello.
Today, we are diving into housing justice issues and how social movements can influence policymaking processes on housing. We will look at the case of Berlin and Over, and we are so excited to welcome Rossella joining us.
Rossella Ferro is a research fellow at the Department of Architecture and Urban Studies. She works on peripheries and marginalized territories, mainly housing justice and participatory spatial projects. She's part of Cura Lab, interdisciplinary research group involving urbanists and anthropologists based in the off-campus San Siro, where she researches the co-production of knowledge with local actors. Rossella is also part of a collective that promotes cultural and generative projects in depopulated areas and has a background as a housing activist in Milan.
We are going to start from Rossella's thesis with the title of The Housing Policymaking Process in Berlin, a Field of Co-Production. We will discuss housing affordability and unaffordability issue, let's say, and the role of housing movements, grassroots initiatives, and projects to be a part of policy-making process or influence public debate in Berlin, and then we will reflect on housing in Milan. Let's go.
Urbinary.
Hey Rossella, welcome to Urbinary. We are so happy to have you here.
Welcome, Rossella. We are happy to speak with you today about such a contemporary and relevant topic. Could you introduce your thesis work with just some sentences? And then, of course, we'll go deeper in the topic during the conversation.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here with you today. Thank you, Sareh, Tommaso, and the Urbinary Project for giving me the opportunity to share my research on Berlin. This was precisely the main aim of the study, visiting and learning from Berlin and bringing back to the Milanese context some takeaways about the housing issue and struggle. My thesis provides an overview on the complex relations and interactions between the housing movement in Berlin over the last decade and the institutional policymaking process. I analyze the patterns of interaction and the policy outcomes and how the interplay between the movement and the politics impacted the policy and city production.
These days, the problem of affordable housing is a pressing issue in many large European cities. As housing prices continue to rise, accessibility to decent, affordable accommodation is becoming increasingly difficult. And it leads to concerns about housing insecurity and inequality. This topic it's not only a concern for citizens who have struggled to find an affordable home, but also for the governments trying to tackle the growing problem of housing. And many scholars and researchers have addressed this issue, studying it from different aspects, its causes, consequences, and potential solutions and alternatives. Also, we are witnessing the emergence of nonprofit organizations, grassroots initiatives, and communities that they're fighting for housing rights in the cities.
This problem has become so pressing that it invested also countries like Italy, characterized by a strong ownership percentage. Only some years ago, a topic that seems distant and felt urgent only by some restricted housing movement, now, after a decade of rampant increase of the housing costs and the protest of the tent movement, spread across most of the biggest Italian cities, seems one of the most hot and urgent topic on the public discussion. It involves the students that have a dream of studying in a renowned university far from home, the workers, both skilled and not, that are attracted by the higher job possibility of the biggest cities, and the residents that are expelled from the places that they live. What seems only a someone else's problem now is felt as a national problem, showing the need for targeted policies also in a homeowner nation as Italy.
So, Rossella, as the first question, I would like to ask you that what ignited your interest to study this topic?
Well, I decided to conduct my master thesis in Berlin after attending a workshop there. And there are multiple reasons. I remember finding a poster hanging on a wall in a street where a young couple was seriously offering 200 euros to anyone who would allow them to visit their apartment to rent. These people were literally offering money to get the opportunity to eventually rent a house. I was shocked. It was summer of 2021, and during COVID, people reflected a lot on the issues related to housing, how it is relevant to have a safe and comfortable space, and how rents were becoming unsustainable, especially in large or touristic urban areas. In Milan, after the rent increase shortly stopped in 2020, prices started to grow fast again. At the time, I was also consulting a group of municipalities in the Milanese hinterland that were interested in updating their knowledge and policy on housing. And I was noticing all the lack and problems in the practical application of our few national policy to try to keep rents affordable, such as the Canone Concordato. In September 2021, a popular referendum in Berlin voted to expropriate large landlords, namely owners of rental housing stock with more than 3,000 units. With all these motivations, I decided to spend some time in Berlin and check how people were organizing there to contrast rent increases and, in general, to question politics about the unmatched right to housing and the city. I was there between January and March 2022 and then went back and forth for about 6 months. That was initially possible thanks to the Thesis Abroad scholarship offered by the Polyme. That is a simple and effective resource I recommend to every student that is excited to have a research experience abroad.
Wow. Thanks for sharing your story and your recommendation for students. Yeah, actually, the housing issue became even more pressing aftermath COVID-19.
Urbinary.
I would like to start our conversation regarding the context of your research, the city of Berlin. Well, when it comes to Berlin, it's inevitable to not think about what this city has been through. This city has witnessed such a history that we cannot distinguish it from Berlin's urban identity and actually making it a unique city with distinct characteristics.
Totally agree with you, Sarah. It's marvelous to reflect of the history's intricacy that shaped the city with strong traces also in today's urban form and society. A divided urbanity that shaped how thousands of people experience space and social construct that is still partially present in today's Berlin.
How can we link what the city has been through in the past and what is experiencing right now in urban issues perspective, and in particular housing in Berlin?
As you said, Berlin is a unique city for many reasons. Its recent past and the reunification have a significant role in understanding the ongoing housing crisis and the consequent protest movement. In 1989, the fall of the wall, which divided the city lengthwise in two parts, the capitalist West and the socialist East, represents a turning point for the current configuration of the city and its governance. First, a vast urban restructuring took place, and it is still ongoing on the former wall site. You have to imagine a strip of dead land, large up to 150 meters, that was available for redevelopment right in the middle of the city, leading to early gentrification processes like the famous case of Prenzlauer Berg and the first anti-displacement struggle. Another relevant phenomenon related to reunification was the rise of a class of professional landlords. Starting from 1933, a significant number of people lost control of their own property, such as Jewish families that had to leave or were deported, or later people that were stuck on the other side of the city or the state. After their reunification, it started a process of restituting properties to the heirs, who often entrusted large professional landlords to manage their buildings. These are still relevant actors of the housing system in Berlin. Then, in 2001, a fiscal crisis hit the state-owned bank. Berlin is, in fact, a city-state. The extreme budgetary emergency that followed has been used to justify several years of austerity urbanism and neoliberal policy. It started the process of the funding of social housing and self-help construction projects and the extensive privatization of infrastructure companies and the housing stock for a sellout of 220,000 housing units from the late 90s till the late nuts. The economic model definitely shifted under a neoliberal regime. and after the bank scandal, the conservative government of the city was overthrown by a social democrat and leftist coalition for the next 14 years, which launched a new international image of Berlin, the poor but sexy city, a creative, emerging global city with a tolerant and easygoing attitude. Its success and attractivity also to the massive availability of cheap housing and affordable art and music spaces. Another historical factor relevant to our story is related to Berlin's social and cultural composition and the housing culture of the city. During the division, West Berlin was basically an island surrounded by the GDR, with many complications to move out from the city, etc. It promoted tax reliefs and benefits, such as the exclusion from the military service, to push people to remain or to move there. This attracted, for example, young people with no war and anti-system ideals, which started alternative and self-managed housing projects that led to the famous squatting movement of Berlin between the 70s and 80s. I was speaking about the housing culture of the city because, in general, both in the West and in the East, people were used to cheap rent price, a condition that lasted since the last decade. The population shrank by half after the war, which determined an enormous availability of housing and a lot of empty spaces not claimed, and consequently a strong tradition of housing and spaces appropriation.
What is the situation now in Berlin in terms of housing? Did it grow again, the population, or it's remained like this?
Now, of course, the population grow again. I told you about this great activity that started from the 2000, early 2000, and now there is a huge housing pressure in Berlin.
Okay.
So, as you clearly explained, there are many layers intertwined and contributed to making this issue. Let's say the legacy of the Berlin Wall in physical terms that shaped the urban landscape, catalyzing process of gentrification and displacement, and large empty spaces in the middle of the city, as well as its social and political effects on the city's governance. Also, you mentioned about the rise of potential landlords post reunification and the subsequent neoliberal policies and the city's tradition in housing movements. So, overall, I can say that we are discussing a complex interplay between history, politics, and housing. So, I think for us and for our listeners, it would be interesting to know about your methodology. How did you approach this topic to study? Which tools have you used?
At first, I had a privileged access point to observe the urban dynamics. I lived in a WG, a shared apartment, in a social housing project in Neukölln. And some of my housemates were housing activists, which is something relatively diffuse in Berlin, at least in comparison to Milan. When I got there, I attended the meetings of a group of young researchers at the Department for Urban and Regional Sociology at the Humboldt University, guided by Professor Andrei Holm. In the beginning, I was so confused about all the tools and housing policies and all the different groups and initiatives tackling the housing crisis. To give you an idea, experts and activists estimate that around 150 grassroots initiatives have been established in Berlin in the last 10-15 years, which is something crazy for us to think about. So I started a patient desk work through every kind of possible source to build a timeline of the last decade in Berlin, considering three main indicators. At first, the rise of the housing prices, then the evolution of the housing policies, and then the main episodes of the housing movement, to start tracing down possible interplays between these three factors. Then I conducted interviews with the representatives of 6 different groups of the housing movement. Some of them were collective interviews that made it even more interesting. And we discussed their point of view and their perception of their role in the policy making process. and one of them was also a politician. The starting point of the interviews was my timeline draft, which was collectively redefined during every interview. Everyone was adding pieces to the patchwork, underlying the importance of a specific event, or giving me a particular feedback on the broad view of the process. And surprisingly, it was a moment of mutual learning for everyone, also for the more expert in the movement, because the timeline offered a pretty complete picture of the parallel evolution of prices, initiatives, and policies. So I think they appreciated the exchange and receiving the material after the discussion.
Wow, it's really interesting that you immersed yourself in Berlin's housing activism landscape and observe it from close lens. I also would like to stress the importance of making a sort of collaborative environment of mutual learning in our research, exactly what you've done in the case of the timeline. The process of incorporating informal knowledge into academic research and then offering the product, let's say, in exchange. So let's go a bit in depth. Would you share with us more regarding the dynamic of these initiatives and movements? How do they contribute to the policymaking process?
My understanding is that the great number of groups, unions, collectives, and coalitions that constitute the broader Berlin housing movement is part of the answer. There is a consistent variety between the political practices. Inhabitants of condominiums organizing to stop the rising rent, social housing tenants, group of citizens contrasting urban development projects and gentrification. The attitudes and approaches to the institutions and the policymaking process vary from the ethical sensitivity of each group and change over time depending on the specific political circumstance. But what is important is that the sum of these different approaches and practices contributes to the growing debate around housing justice, to identify or exclude solutions, to contrast or promote policy outcomes. I identified several patterns of interaction that the movement used to interact with the policymaking process. First, the essential role of the pressure from street politics, with demonstration, rallies, and so on. Second, I would like to underline the role of knowledge as a premise for interaction with politicians. For example, there are study groups and platforms that work to provide legislative and administrative information to the movement. There is an approach that is explicitly confrontative, which considers the interaction with the institution time-consuming and not effective, and prefers to develop alternative policies and mutual help networks, for example, or other more hybrid approaches with light personal interaction with some politicians and a direct import of ideas from the streets to the parties. The referendum is a tool that was extensively explored by the housing movement. A first binding referendum failed in 2015 due to a wrong legal formulation. There was then the success of the advisory referendum for expropriation in 2021. And now the movement is organizing for a new binding referendum on expropriation of large landlords, since the previous one remained unheard. There is a dialogic cooperative approach that recognizes the states as an intermediary. For example, the Urban Policy Initiative Forum is basically an interface platform between the various initiatives and the Berlin Parliament, where they promote public hearings and provide practical tools to the organizations. Lastly, there is what I call the challenging cooperative approach. Groups experimenting with practices toward new urban governance forms, such as public-civic partnership for urban development projects. These patterns of interactions aren't mutually exclusive, and even the same group experience a coexistence and circularity of practices and attitudes. This is the richness of the housing movement in Berlin.
Rossella, hearing about all these movements, it was interesting to see these different approaches, but how do they interact with between each others? do they interact with each other's? Do they value each other's approaches? Or is there a fight between the housing movement in Berlin?
Of course, there are a lot of contradictions, but basically, the movement recognizes itself and recognize the difference and the value of the different approaches. So I think that this is really an interesting approach.
Okay, thanks a lot. But how do you feel about the future of the housing movement in Berlin? And do you feel that the last conquest and policies will truly change the path taken so far? And of course, do you feel that the failure of the last referendum will hinder the proceeding of the policies, or it's just a small bump in a long road of changing?
I think that about the policy outcomes, we should probably plan another podcast because there is a lot happening in Berlin, and my research is not updated to the recent evolutions that I follow from a distance. I can say that there is not always a linearity between the claims and struggle of the movement and the housing policy making. For example, the rent cap introduced in 2020 in Berlin, which had pretty good coverage in the European debate on rental housing policy, was not a direct claim of the movement, but an attempt of the local administration to slow down the movement wave that was preparing a referendum with a much more radical proposal. Soon the rent cap was declared unconstitutional, lasting only about 1 year. However, the movement was still able to promote an advisory referendum that had a great success in September 2021. Nearly 60% of Berliners voted in favor of expropriating large landlords owning more than 3,000 units for social purposes. After more than 2 years of political discussion, the town government did not implement the referendum, with a great delusion from the voters. They are now organizing for a new referendum with binding conditions. So it was not a failure. It's just a continuous process, back and forth, but it is evident the relevance of an active and extended movement in promoting and producing social and policy change.
Let's come back to a city that we all study and live, like Milan. The rent increase in Milan is crazy. It is a noticeable issue. We all experience it. And last summer in 2023, we witnessed the emergence of tent movement that started right here at Politecnico di Milano by a student, and then more students joining this movement, and it spreads throughout the Italy. What about Milan? I would like to know your reflection. How can we draw a line in housing situation or housing movements in Berlin and Milan?
Of course, the phenomena of rising rents and house prices, gentrification, and territorial polarization between centers and peripheral areas have a global extent, with local peculiarities and articulations. The dismantling of public housing or large stock of social rental housing endangers housing affordability. This was at the base of the housing crisis in Berlin, together with the financialization of housing hitting the city after the 2008 crisis. A similar mechanism happening here in Milan and everywhere in Europe, even right now, not far from here, with the attempt of the municipality of Milan to sell 119 housing units in Viale Lombardia. The significant difference I see is the structure and solidity of the social movement infrastructure. The level of capillary organizing and resources between the movement in Milan and Berlin is not comparable. Even if we know that Italy had in the past, even in the recent past, and I'm thinking to the 2013-14 housing struggle, Italy had a quite large capability to mobilize for housing at the national level. The tent movement had a huge impact on public opinion, and that's great. It was impressive how an action that started in a pretty individual dimension could inspire students all over Italy and catch all the news headlines for weeks and shake the local politicians. They hit a raw nerve, not only for students, but speaking in general about cities that are increasingly exclusive or for tourists. I think we, the society, and especially the other components affected by the housing crisis, were not able to properly support the students' claims. Interpret the 10th episode as the beginning of something that we will probably see and evaluate in a medium term. Learning from Berlin to produce social change and impact on policy, we need a combination of different perspectives and approaches. And I see here a crucial role for us as experts of the urban and the housing policy in sharing knowledge, good practices, and ideas.
Drawing interest from your research on Berlin policies, which is your evaluation of the Italian housing policy situations? Can we do something more? And especially what?
This is an excellent question. I think we need at first to protect and maybe to extend the large rental supply stock, such as public housing and some experiences of cooperative housing under the regime of undivided ownership, because this stock serves the most fragile part of the population. And we are witnessing how many people are now at risk of exclusion and displacement from Milan, because they cannot afford a house, even if they live and work and have an essential role in the city functioning. Also, the administration should prevent the localized dynamics of speculative sales and gentrification or touristification. About that, in Germany, there is a policy that is called social conservation areas that imposes special housing market rules in areas with a tight housing market or where prices suddenly start to rise. An interesting proposal the experts are working on is a policy called New Non-Profit Housing Scheme that basically aims to reintroduce some principles for social housing production that were abolished in 1989, reintroducing ideas for land decommodification and the concept of housing as a right for all and a social good.
Thanks a lot for this overview of the policies. And before we started this podcast, we were chatting about the social conservation areas and that they draw their ideas from the environmental issues. Could you tell something more about it?
Yes, so the social conservation areas is an urban policy that is derived from the environmental protection areas that we are more used to know also here in Italy. And the social conservation areas concept is that urban environments has a certain biodiversity, let's say. It is important for the city and for the to have a vibrant city and vital city. It's an application of this concept to protect the differences in the neighborhood that are at risk of displacement of the poor.
Urbinary.
Okay, Rossella, thank you so much for providing us this comprehensive image of what is going on in Berlin, the dynamic of housing movements and policies there. And thank you for sharing with us your insights on this topic. So for final question, I want to ask you, as a young researcher in urban studies and planning, what type of researcher or what type of planner do you aspire to be?
Okay, my desire is to serve the community and support social change, promoting a more equitable use of our collective resources, such as land, water, and air, towards cities and society that aspire to be more just. I think the only way to achieve this goal is with inclusionary planning processes involving the most fragile and marginalized population. And I think we, as researchers, and in general, knowledge co-production processes, could have a relevant role in pursuing that goal.
Urbinary.
Thanks for joining us today, Rossella.
Thanks a lot, and it was really interesting to speak to you about this topic today, and hope to see you soon.
Yes, thank you. It was funny and it was a great conversation. Ciao, ciao.
For our listeners, stay tuned for our next episode with Delara and Daniel, who will be in conversation with Beatrice Belle. In the upcoming episode, we will maintain a social focus, but this time we are shifting to the specialty of the social field. Delara will explore unused and abandoned buildings in the city and the emerging forms of their revitalization and reuse through bottom-up practices. Urbinary is produced in collaboration with Poliradio, the official radio channel at Politecnico di Milan.
Urbinary, the podcast cataloging the everyday and extraordinary in the city.